Chapter 36. Taking care of my mental and emotional health was clearly not something I'd achieved successfully. Prior to entering the mental health system, I didn't know anything much about looking after that dimension of myself, and my experiences in the psychiatric hospital revealed to me that no one is immune to mental illness. It's a scary thing. Many of the patients in Rata Villa were there as a result of a life crisis of some sort with which they had ultimately become unable to cope. This manifested in different ways and through different diagnoses, but we were all there because something had gone badly wrong with our lives, and that can happen to anyone. I've heard it said that one of the reasons there is so much stigma attached to mental illness is that human beings have an innate subconscious fear of losing their minds. It appears to me that sanity is often maintained through good luck rather than good management. It is not something that many of us think much about or plan for until we find ourselves without it. The dimension of Te Taha Hinenaro, the mind, to me encompasses the whole mind and all its attendant actions and functions. It includes the mind as the centre of cognition, that is, our processing of sensory information resulting in perception, intuition, awareness and judgment. It includes psychological activity, that is, the mind as a director of human behaviour and involved in originating such concepts as will and morale. And the mind is the seat of our emotions. The mind has a big job to do, and it does it with startling perfection until we start lobbing curveballs at it. Even then, the circuitry will often reroute itself around physical or chemical obstacles and carry on being one of the most amazing and complex physical entities in our known universe. In assessing the state of our mental and emotional well-being, we can look for markers in our feelings, thoughts and behaviour. Examining our responses to stress, the Western culture's health crisis of modern times, provides a good illustration. Stress, either too much or too little, can manifest in all those areas of mental functioning. Too little, and for short periods that is called restful. Over time, though, that might develop into a loss of ambition and motivation and manifest in the onset of boredom, idleness, depression and restlessness. Too much stress, for a time this might energise us and help us to achieve something we need to do. Too long in the stress zone, though, and our body starts to rely on that mental state to fuel the activation of adrenaline, keep us in the buzz. Humans in the Western world have a tendency to treat ourselves as superhuman, and we like to believe we can handle whatever life throws at us. The ability to multitask is portrayed as a virtue. Initially, mental stress can help us to be very productive. The mind both works in tandem with and controls the body's hormonal functions, for example, regulating the release of adrenaline, and upon that release we feel mentally sharper, we can make quick decisions, we feel alert, and that we are in peak performance mode. But the mind can only take so much. What in short bursts is an innate survival mechanism, over longer periods of activation the stress response starts to become a liability. It begins to affect our feelings. We become scratchy and irritable, experiencing frustration and maybe anger at any obstacle to our efforts. We might experience feelings of being overwhelmed. We cry because we're overtired and can't seem to relax. We develop a short fuse. Too much exposure to stress, our own or someone else's, begins to affect our thought processes. We become anxious, fretting and worrying over whatever is the source of the stress, and we become increasingly preoccupied with that subject. Our thought processes change from initially being reasoned and logical to becoming obsessive, maybe even edging towards paranoid. We start second-guessing what others might be thinking about us, and we may start inventing scenarios based on these perceptions, which are increasingly mental constructions rather than actual occurrences. Our judgment and reasoning becomes impaired. These thoughts and feelings in turn affect our behaviour. As we load ourselves with more and more pressure and we start feeling overwhelmed and like things are starting to get out of control, our natural response is to start trying to exert control. This exertion may initially be over whatever was creating the stress, but eventually spreads to other areas of our lives, and usually the lives of others in closest proximity to us. As the stress levels and attempts to control our environment increase, we start to experience actual physical symptoms such as not being able to sleep, loss of appetite, pain, poor concentration, and memory lapse. We may compensate by downing cups of coffee to keep ourselves performing at the adrenalised pace we're becoming accustomed to, and snipping and sniping at those around us as our patience, tolerance, and concern for others erodes. It brings to mind an adage that's supposed to be funny, but all too often it rings true. I'm down to my last nerve and you're on it. Mental health and an illness exist on a continuum. Sorry to break it to you, but the above scenarios, common to many, can be fertile ground for the development of either a transient or enduring period of mental illness. Sure, you can throw in the genetic and hereditary debate. It won't happen to me because there's no family history. Mental illness is not in our genes. But sometimes this just aids the self-delusion, and mostly we just carry on at the frenetic pace of modern life. Some people survive it intact, other people crash and burn along the way, physically, mentally, or both. Whether you'll be a survivor or a burnout probably won't become apparent until you're already well advanced along that track. If a transient rough patch, which most people can relate to, is at one end of the illness continuum, then at the other end are the apparently intractable permanent mental illnesses. In the New Zealand health sector, these sufferers are referred to as the 3%, in reference to the proportion of the population that high-end mental health services are directed at. For the 3%, it is often more noticeable that something is amiss. The regular and revolving door interactions with mental health services is one of the more obvious signs. It can be harder for the other 97% to recognise when things are moving beyond what might be considered normal in that person's perception or social context. If mental health and illness exist on a continuum, so too does recovery. You can be a little better or a lot better. You can have lighter or less symptoms some of the time or all of the time. You might never have symptoms again, or they might return only under certain circumstances, and there are things that you can do to influence this. There are a couple of characteristics that a person can foster in themselves if they're serious about regaining their mental health. Firstly, developing the desire and willingness to change. Getting to that point can be the hardest part of recovery from mental illness and addiction. Things usually have to get fairly bad before we're willing to let go of the ways we know and trade them in for the unknown possibility of a better way of health and of life. The other thing we need is permission from ourselves and others around us to make mistakes. Making mistakes is a perfectly acceptable part of life for most people. It's one of the ways that human beings learn. But for a person with a mental illness, this can be something we have to reclaim our right to. All too often, under well-intentioned case management and or family influence, a person with mental illness is encouraged to stay right where they are. Attempts to move outward in their lives, taking on new things, taking risks, and expressing the desire to move on from our status as patients may be met with a sharp intake of breath from those around us. Compare the comments a person diagnosed with a mental illness will often receive, say, if they're wanting to move into a new flat or take up a course. Are you sure that won't be too much for you? You don't want to push yourself, you don't want to become unwell. What does the doctor think? Have you taken your medication today? A person without a mental illness will more likely receive these sorts of comments. That's great, how can I help? I'm really excited for you. A change is as good as a rest. Good luck, I hope it goes well for you, and so on. The only way we truly come to understand our relationship with our mental illness, discover for ourselves where our assets and limitations lie, and when our strengths and weaknesses become exposed, is when we step out of our comfort zones and reclaim our birthright to experience an array of what life has to offer. If we can get ourselves to this point, then we have rediscovered our capacity to try. That's all we have to do, try. From there, we can recapture the ability to make choices and attempt to put into action changes that might improve our well-being.